Thank you, Leo. I'm going to get this thing going. Thank you, sister. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. It's true, I wrote a book, and this is it. And why write a book, right? This is a question I had to face in conscience a couple of years ago. I suppose anybody who covers the beat for 30 years has a book in them somewhere, especially if that beat is the Vatican. Because you see and hear so much that just does not fit into the news stories. The personalities, the archaic procedures, the rivalries, the good intentions, the flawed execution, the habits, the customs. And then you realize later that was the real story. I wrote the book because after 30 years, I realized my best stories were the ones I came home and told my wife at the end of the day. And I also realized no one had done a book like this. And so it was sitting there waiting to be told. I wanted to take an honest and entertaining look at the Vatican. I wanted to tell stories about the people who live and work there and make them less these cardboard cutout figures that you usually see in the media, and more these real, human, fallible, I would say at times quietly heroic, in some cases, quietly heroic people that I come to know. There are a lot of myths out there about the Vatican. Typically the Vatican is perceived as this kind of monolithic power structure, hermetically sealed, where the orders come down from on high and everybody marches in lockstep. And of course, this was not the Vatican that I had come to know. The reality is quite different. The Vatican I knew was a place where the cardinals who worked for the Pope spoke too much. Thank God. As a journalist, thank God. Where leaks were common. Again, thank God. It's a place that is much more decentralized than people would ever imagine. It's a place where these lower-level officials and bit players can easily take center stage, and in some ways that are good, in some ways that are bad. The lines of authority run in odd directions. It's not just the Pope issuing orders and everyone carries them out. The Roman Curia, the Vatican's bureaucracy, is this mosaic of little bureaucratic fiefdoms, and each office goes back, in some cases, decades, in some cases, centuries. And they sort of feel that their authority is separate from the rest of the bureaucracy as well. It's a place where you can easily make connections. I remember when John Paul II was Pope, I would occasionally be asked to have the Pope pray for someone. People back home in Minnesota, where I was from, thought I had a direct line to the Pope, I guess, and through him a direct line to God. And so I would scribble out a note, send it up to the Pope, and I always knew that those prayers were done because his secretary would write me a note a few days later saying, "You prayed for this person's intention on this morning before Mass." It's a small world, actually. Part of this is what I wanted to convey. It's the flavor of the Vatican, the personalities, the atmosphere, and the humanness of the place. So what's it like backstage at the Vatican? It's a place of tremendous contradictions. It's a place where, as I write in my book, even as the Vatican's doctrinal officials were investigating the founder of a religious order for sex abuse, other officials in the Secretariat of State were protecting him. It's a place where, as I wrote in my first chapter, where the bell ringer at St. Peter's Basilica refuses to ring the bells at St. Peter's because he was supposed to ring them when a new pope was elected in 2005. And everybody wondered, why didn't the bells ring? It's because he received the order to ring the bells from the Swiss Guard. And he worked for the Basilica of St. Peter, not for the Swiss Guards. And there's an ancient turf battle between the Basilica employees and the Swiss Guards. It's a place where communications officials at the Vatican launch social media projects, and they have launched a great number. But none of them are really interactive because, of course, the Vatican is afraid of reading the comments. They don't want to see those comments. In a sense, the church has been speaking in a monologue for so long that they're not quite ready to take that step. It's a place where the Pope declares, takes the revolutionary step of declaring he is resigning from the papacy. But he announces this in Latin, so that half the cardinals in the room did not know what he had just spoken. I hope that our new Pope Francis reads my book, because I think it lays out his battlefield if he's serious about reforming the Vatican. It identifies some chronic problems, especially in communication. It identifies some unsung heroes and some internal debates. And I think it gives an accurate picture of the mentalities and the practice that still reign throughout the Vatican bureaucracy. I used a storytelling approach in my book. I didn't want to write another book about this is how the Vatican works, and this guy answers to this guy, and who answers to this guy. My episodes revolve around characters, big and small, that make things happen at the Vatican. To give one example, and I'm going to read a few things from my book, and then I'm going to talk a little about Pope Francis, and then I'm going to answer your questions. One example of the people who make things happen. The process of declaring someone a saint relies to a great degree on people willing to push the sainthood cause. Okay? Religious orders have a huge advantage, as I'm sure some of you know, because they leave a religious order whose members for decades or centuries, however long it takes, will keep pushing the cause of their founder or a prominent member. In the case of Pope Pius XII, I discovered that one of the prime movers behind the scenes was an American nun who from time to time would drop in Rome and try to light a fire under Vatican officials, including the Pope. So I described my first encounter with her, and I'll read you this. The voice at the other end of the phone was gravelly, with a thick New Jersey accent. She was selling a story, something about a book she'd written on Pius XII. I'd never met her, but she was about to correct that. You better come see me, dear, this is going to be big. It was 2003, and with the debate over Pius and the Holocaust reaching a crescendo, it seemed like a good story. I did go to see her at the convent near the Vatican where she was staying, a house of the religious teachers Filippini, an order founded more than 300 years ago. Sister Margarita Marchione, 82 years old, but you'd never guess it, came into the foyer not with one book, but with a stack of various volumes, and slapped them down on the table. There you go, darling, you've got plenty to write about now. She stood about 5 feet tall and wore the dark habit of her order, a black shawl-like affair that she tugged at as she sat down in front of me. Her graying hair was visible under a soft black bonnet, and a pair of oversized glasses made her eyes look like cannons ready to fire. She wore a continuous smile that seemed genuine. "We've got to get Pius XII beatified, Johnny," she declared. "The man was a saint." Johnny? I hadn't been called that since 5th grade. And in fact, there was something about this scene that reminded me of my parochial school education. Picking a slim hardcover book from the pile, she continued, "This is my latest. I had to write it with the smear campaign going on against this good man. I gave a copy to the Pope the other day. It was titled simply Pope Pius XII, and it laid out the case that the late pontiff had prudently and quietly helped the Jews, opposed Hitler at every turn, and practiced the virtues of a saint. "Do you have children? They'll love this," she said, pulling out a copy of Pius XII, the children's pope. A biography in easy-to-color line drawings, along with a brief narrative. I turned to a page titled The Holocaust and read, "In Germany, Adolf Hitler killed thousands of Jewish people and others. The Pope saved many by hiding them in the Vatican and in convents and monasteries. He also provided them with money, food, and clothing." Another page recalled how Pius once found an injured bird in the Vatican gardens and nursed it back to health. It would perch on his shoulder during meal times, hopping down to eat from its own dish of seeds and keeping him company. "It's all true," Sister Margarita said, looking over my shoulder. "People forget what a beautiful human being this man was. How many children do you have? 3? Take one for each of them, dear." Sister Margarita was quite a character, and she's still going strong. I have no doubt that she will make herself known to Pope Francis. Pius XII has yet to be beatified. By the way, although in this section of my book she may come across as a partisan supporter, she actually is a respected historian, and she wrote a book documenting the work that convents and monasteries and other church institutes in Rome, the help that they gave to the Jews during World War II. So she set out and got access and documented all this, something no historian had done. So she's actually added to the literature. One of the great things about covering the Vatican was I got to cover the Pope when he went abroad on his foreign trips. And this would invariably impress people back in Minnesota. You travel with the Pope on his plane. Oh my God, how great that must be. And it was great, although probably not quite as great in the same way that they were thinking. I mean, we were in the coach class, you understand. We paid big bucks to be on that plane. The Pope and his entourage were in the front of the plane. John Paul II would actually have the habit of wandering back to our section and strolling through the press pack and taking questions. And that was great. You could get a conversation going. Pope Benedict didn't like to do the walkthrough. It was a little too close to the journalists. He would, however, take questions, but they were submitted ahead of time, and then he would stand at the front of the plane like this, and the questions would be read off, and he would recite, he would give an off-the-cuff answer, but it looked like he was taking dictation from God, because everything, the guy is so smart that he always sounded that way. You know, it's like it was all up there already. We were coddled. The papal press corps was coddled. There were always about 50 or 60 of us on the press plane. We were given papal speeches ahead of time. We were taken to papal venues. We were given, preferential treatment in some ways. But in other ways, it was perhaps better not to be part of the papal press pack because we were very much controlled. You know, they didn't want us talking to people at a papal mass. Well, what's the point of going if you can't talk to the people you're visiting? It was, however, always exciting to be on a papal trip. And I remember one of my first trips was to India. And it was a crazy trip. We crisscrossed the country 5 or 6 times with John Paul II. And we ended up in Shillong, which is in northern India, somewhere near the Chinese border, and Pope was saying a mass there. I went up, I was one of the few reporters to actually go to that event, because most reporters stay in the press office, in the press center back in New Delhi. It shocks people when I tell them this, but you know, there are many reporters who cover the Pope who never really eyeball the Pope live. They're watching it on a press screen in a press room. I always tried to get there and, again, talk to the people who we weren't supposed to be talking to. I happened to spy a group of strangely dressed men, and they turned out to be former headhunters. I stress the former part. They had very long and very sharp machetes. In fact, I interviewed one of them using an interpreter, and he made a point of showing me how sharp the machete still was. And he said rather nostalgically, I only use it to scalp monkeys now. They did a dance, not a headhunting dance, during the liturgy, but the dance of the woodpecker, which involved them kind of wielding their swords around. It was stuff that I never thought I would see. I'm going to read one little section from the chapter on papal travels. I could have written an entire book on traveling with the Pope, and again, I'm surprised that no one has done a Boys on the Bus book. The guy who organized papal trips for many, many years was a Jesuit, Father Roberto Tucci. He was excellent at his job, and we journalists liked him because he talked too much. He would always tell us what he thought, which was dangerous in the eyes of some Vatican officials. But in this particular trip, we were in Swaziland in Africa. Has anybody ever been to Swaziland? No? Well, I have. And it's a tiny country surrounded by South Africa. I'll read you what I wrote. I walked over and chatted with Father Tucci in the Swazi sunshine, and I soon learned the cause of his consternation. The Mass was ready to begin, but the Vatican was waiting for Swaziland's 20-year-old king, Mswati III, who had a habit of arriving late. As Tucci glanced at his watch, a government official in a dark blue suit approached us. Coming a little bit late is considered a sign of respect in our country, he explained. Tucci said nothing. His eyebrows heaved in exasperation, and he badly needed a cigarette. The Pope began celebrating the liturgy, and a few minutes later, a cheer went up. King Mswati had finally arrived, riding along the stadium track in a vintage Cadillac convertible toward his seat of honor. I watched Tucci grumble into his walkie-talkie and shake his head. "Get a load of this," he muttered. I looked up, and I saw the young king was accompanied by 2 of his 4 wives. Polygamy is widespread in Swaziland, and King Mswati always made sure he got first connubial dibs among the country's female population. 3 weeks before the Pope arrived, Swaziland had held its annual reed dance, in which tens of thousands of young virgins gather to dance bare-breasted, twirl reeds, and sing in an effort to be noticed by the king, who chooses a new bride from among them. For the girls, selection as the king's latest wife is a unique chance to escape poverty, or at least that was the line I got from the Swazi official at the Mass. He also explained that it wasn't as easy as it looks to pick a bride from 20,000 girls dancing in a field. This year, the king, not wanting to rely on first impressions, had videotaped the dance and made his decision afterward. In a bit of irony that probably went right past everyone in attendance, the Pope's sermon at the Stadium Mass defended Christian marriage and sharply criticized polygamy, saying it was disrespectful to women. If the king and his wives were offended, they didn't show it. Oftentimes we would ask, do papal trips have an impact? And sometimes you could see they did. They often had a political impact in places like Poland. And they had a spiritual impact too. I think there are many African priests I've met in Rome over the years who said they felt called to the priesthood after they saw John Paul II come to their country. So, there are effects, but if you're a journalist trying to read these effects or future effects while it's going on, that's a pretty tough task. Africa, I loved going to Africa. They really had a party atmosphere when the Pope landed. I remember Burkina Faso, when we rode in a 20-mile motorcade from the airport into the city, and it was like a neighborhood block party that went on for 20 miles. And there were rock bands at every corner. I mean, it was just tremendous energy. And I recognize that a papal visit is not a typical moment for any African country, or probably for any country. But it was just such a great way to see countries in Africa. African and other countries would also go out of their way to do their best to welcome the Pope. And what that meant was that they would often build things. They would often improve the infrastructure before a Pope would arrive. So, at least along the papal motorcade route, the streets would be repaved. Sometimes entire airports were redone. There was a time we landed in Zambia when we got off the bus, and of course reporters always want to be following the papal motorcade into the city. That's when you see the people, the excitement, and everything. So the papal bus, the papal Popemobile would leave first, and then you would have all kinds of Vatican officials, and then us, the reporters, coming along in buses usually. Well, Zambia had minibuses set up for us, and I was always first one on the minibus. I wanted to be right up there in front. And they had also redone the airport. They put in speed bumps. The speed bumps were very high. And when our minibus took off after the Pope, it got hung up on the first speed bump. And it was literally on there like a teeter-totter. We all had to get off and lift the bus off, by which time the Pope was long gone. We never saw him for the rest of the day. Then there was Azerbaijan with John Paul II. Azerbaijan had also redone the airport, and they had a brand new double-decker press bus. We knew it was new because they still had all that plastic stuff on the windows and the seats. We got on it, and oh man, wow, they spent some money on this. Sure enough, the Pope's motorcade took off. We were right behind it until the first overpass, which ripped the top off the double-decker bus. And if you've ever been in a bus that hits an overpass, you know it's a very loud experience. It was like, terrible. Fortunately, no one was injured, but the bus driver, I think, thought it was a terrorist attack. And so instead of slowing down or stopping, he kept driving at an even faster pace towards some safe spot well outside the city. So once again, we never saw the Pope that day. The press covers the Vatican as best it can. There are built-in problems with covering the Vatican. One is that a journalist assigned to cover the Vatican is usually covering other things. At Catholic News Service, we have the luxury of covering the Vatican full-time. Most news agencies don't have that luxury. They're off covering wars or Italian crises or Berlusconi's latest escapades. So they squeeze in the Vatican and the Pope whenever they can. So there's a lot of misconceptions that make their way into news articles. And a lot of times, reporters take the easy way. They decide that if anything is said or written or done by anyone mildly associated with the Vatican, that it's called the Vatican. If somebody writes a news article in the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, saying, "Oh, The Simpsons was a good TV show," you will see headlines. You did see headlines. Vatican endorses The Simpsons, whatever that means. And so almost anyone can speak for the Vatican in the eyes of the press. Reporters also tend to inflate events. They tend to read too much into things. And I'm going to read you an episode from my chapter titled Latinist, which is a chapter devoted to Father Reginald Foster, who was a Carmelite from Milwaukee, who was the Pope's, or one of the Pope's Latin secretaries. This was a man who spoke his mind always, It should have gotten him in trouble all the time in the Vatican, but rarely did. He was that good at Latin. I'll read you what I wrote. The morning after he was elected, Pope Benedict XVI celebrated Mass in the Sistine Chapel to officially end the conclave. It was the world's first look at the new pontiff, and at the end of the long liturgy, he took his seat on a beige throne and delivered a 5-page sermon. In the Vatican press office, reporters looked at each other in disbelief. The Pope was speaking in Latin instead of the usual Italian. Surely this was a sign of something. As we scrutinized the Italian translation that was handed out at the press office, murmurs filled the room at the surprising content. Pope Benedict was announcing that the Second Vatican Council would remain the compass for the Church under his pontificate. His goal, he said, would be to build an open and sincere dialogue with everyone. He stressed his commitment to ecumenism and bridge building with other religions, as well as to the Church's efforts to promote justice and peace in the world. Pope Benedict, the Church's doctrinal watchdog and conservative theologian par excellence, was taking a liberal stance in his first major address as Pope. It made for a good storyline, and we all wrote articles suggesting that right at the outset, Benedict had signaled that his papacy would not be boxed in by the expectations of traditionalists. Indeed, by outlining such a progressive agenda in Latin, perhaps the new Pope was sending a subtle message to the Church's most conservative wing. I speak your language, but don't share your mindset. Sometime later, when I mentioned to Foster the importance of the Pope's inaugural sermon, he guffawed. Are you kidding? That was just a can thing. We wrote it a week before the conclave, he said. What do you mean, I asked. Well, they needed something to hand the new Pope, something all-purpose, got it? We had him say something about everything. It was generic. Vatican II was great, a bit about war and peace, something nice about young people, ecumenism, the whole bag. He paused and then snorted. Don't tell me you people thought this man was elected Pope one evening and pulls out a 5-page homily in Latin the next morning? I went back and reread the sermon. Sure enough, except for a few introductory lines, it was Vatican boilerplate. Surprisingly well-assembled boilerplate, though. As for the significance of the Pope's delivering his first sermon in Latin, Foster pointed out that it had always been done that way. And he was right about that, too, of course. It had been a long time between popes, and reporters had simply forgotten. And so had I. Part of being backstage at the Vatican or covering it day in, day out, as I did, is that you actually get to go up to the papal library when important people come to meet the Pope. Now, normally there's a pool, which means 2 or at most 3 reporters who get to do this. But because I was there 30 years, I got to do it quite a bit. Here's how it works. You go up and you wait around for about an hour. Okay, you're in place and waiting. And chit-chatting with Vatican people. And you're taken to an antechamber outside the papal library. When a visiting guest arrives, it could be a president, prime minister, a king, they'll come into the papal library and we go in and take a look at them shaking hands. Photographers take their pictures, and then we will all be ushered out, because that's when the Pope and his honored guests have their one-on-one conversations, or 2-on-2 if they have translated. We would be right around the corner, outside the door, waiting, and at that time we would hobnob with Vatican officials, including people like Archbishop Monduzzi, who was the papal, he was the guy who arranged papal events and papal audiences. And he was a garrulous Italian who was a chain smoker And so he would always go to the window beneath one of the beautiful frescoes in this antechamber, open the window, and smoke as many cigarettes as possible in as short a time as possible, blowing the smoke out the window. And then, when it was time to go, he would stuff the pack of cigarettes in his soutane and make his way out. And that was allowed. In fact, if we wanted to join him, we could. But none of us would ever think to bring along a pack of cigarettes. Right? The Pope actually, Pope John Paul II had a button under his desk that he would push when it was time for his guest to go. And that was always determined by the Pope. And when he pushed the button, well, it would sound in our little room. Anduzzi would stash his cigarettes, and we would all straighten up and walk, burst into the room, and they would burst the doors open and say, "Holy Father, it's time for your next appointment. Time to go, wrap things up." And the guest would, "Oh, okay." Pope Benedict moved the button from below the desk to above the desk, sitting on top of the desk. And I often wondered, what it must have been like to be the guy sitting across from the Pope, watching his hand perhaps start to move, and wondering what you could possibly say to make him hesitate. One of the most interesting people I ever met at the Vatican was a guy called Massimo Sansolini. He was a layman. He had a job that was called papal chair bearer. Now, some of you may be old enough to remember the times when Paul VI was carried. Whenever he made grand appearances in St. Peter's Basilica or the square, he was carried on this kind of litter thing with a chair. He would sit on a chair, on a throne, carried above the crowd. And so you needed 6 or 8 or more men to carry this thing. And it was a practical arrangement because everyone could see the Pope. John Paul II was elected. He walked into St. Peter's Basilica and he saw the papal chair and the litter and the chair bearers. And he was supposed to get into the chair and be lifted up. And he said, "Not in the chair, no." And that's how, centuries-old tradition ended. And they were stunned, and they were out of a job. They became ceremonial ushers, papal gentlemen. So Sansolini's job now is still there, is to kind of escort these VIPs who arrive into papal chambers, to stand around, make sure they get out okay. Sansolini, as I said, is a fascinating fellow because he came to the Vatican after a prior career in the world of fashion design. He was an expert in material, especially the best silk. So he tended to look at things at the Vatican through that eye. And I'll read you what I wrote about him. Whenever a world leader arrived for a papal audience, Sansolini was there, dressed in his tuxedo-style uniform with a row of ribboned medals on his lapel. Sansolini watched the VIPs scrupulously, taking mental notes. Afterward, he would pass judgment. And in Sansolini's court of fashion, there was no appeal. European royalty acquitted themselves quite admirably. Meeting Pope John Paul in 1980, Queen Elizabeth was elegance personified, right down to the jeweled E on the sash that draped from her shoulder. Heads of state, on the other hand, were more prone to blunders. French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had earned high marks until he crossed his legs during the Pope's speech, a breach of protocol that Sansolini could hardly believe. The Eastern Europeans were even worse. When Polish Premier Lech Walesa and his wife walked hand in hand down the Vatican corridor on their way to see the Pope, they looked to Sansolini like a couple strolling on their honeymoon. And what was that on her head? Some kind of military beret? When Rice and Gorbachev showed up to see the Pope wearing red instead of the traditional black and no veil, it pained Sansolini to give her demerits because she seemed otherwise like a classy lady. U.S. presidents were habitually the worst violators of the unwritten rules. Jimmy Carter struck Sansolini as someone who had just stepped out of the Georgia backwoods, smiling too much, making too much noise, and moving his arms like windmills. The Americans always seemed baffled by the array of Vatican uniforms, unable to match the rank with the guard. One U.S. president, flush from a papal audience, greeted a long line of Vatican dignitaries, and then, with a flourish, turned toward the Vatican's elevator operator, whose uniform featured shoulder loops and silver buttons, and gave him a snappy military salute. I saw George W. Bush come to the Vatican on more than one occasion, and when Pope Benedict was there, and it was always a kind of a worlds in collision there. They both sort of made the effort. Bush made a greater effort than Benedict, I think. You know, George W. was a backslapper, right? And he would arrive, and he didn't slap the Pope's back, but you almost felt he was about to. He would say, "How's it going, sir?" And everything was wrong with that sentence. Not how's it going and not sir, your holiness, and Benedict always goes, yeah. And I often wonder what their private conversations would have been like. And I would not have been wanting to sit in George W.'s shoes either, because Benedict was not an easy guy to talk to. George W. Bush once brought, you know, every VIP brings a gift, right? And what do you bring the Pope? It's tough. Over the years, he's seen just about everything. Lyndon B. Johnson actually brought the Pope a bust, Pope Paul VI, when he came. He brought Pope Paul VI a bust of himself. I don't know where it ended up. Somebody gave the Pope a sliver of the moon, which ended up in the Vatican museums. But President George W. Bush, on this occasion, had brought the Pope a walking stick. Not just any walking stick, but a walking stick carved rather crudely, but imaginatively, by a homeless man in Texas. And the story behind it was that this stick, the man was helped by somebody in a local church to get back on his feet. It was an entrepreneurial story. It was a story that illustrated how this man didn't accept a handout, he accepted a hand to help him become a productive member of society. Anyway, I'm sure Pope Benedict appreciated it, although he has an array of pastoral staffs. This one was unique. And I saw Vatican, I saw the papal gentlemen, including Sansolini afterwards, kind of looking this thing over. And odd as it was, I think they actually did appreciate it, because, you know, you don't get a gift like that every day. Pope Benedict met with President Bush shortly before Bush left office. That was another odd encounter. President Bush had hosted Pope Benedict at the White House the year before, on the White House lawn, and it was just classic kind of Americana events. They had a fife and drum corps, they had a birthday cake for the Pope, they sang happy birthday for the Pope. The Pope gave Pope gave a talk, and actually Bush gave a talk first, in which he quoted Aristotle in Latin. I noted that, George W. Wright, he was not a theologian, he was not an academic. He once said that he had read one of Pope Benedict's books, but later amended that wisely to saying he had read parts of it. when Benedict finished his speech on that occasion, our president jumped to his feet, rushed over, and said, "Awesome speech, Your Holiness." You got Your Holiness right there. Anyway, as Bush was about to leave office, his people got in touch with the Pope's people and said, "We'd like a kind of farewell meeting at the Vatican." And of course, he said, "Of course, absolutely." Well, we'd kind of like to have it in the Vatican Gardens, they said. And the Vatican said, "Oh, we don't really do that." He said, "Well, could you do it this time?" They pressed. They said okay in the end. Bush wanted to parallel with the White House lawn. They were going to stroll through the Vatican Gardens and have this kind of photo op of two world leaders talking to each other. And the Vatican, as I say, doesn't like that kind of setup because, it's like there's no button. You're kind of captive audience there of the media until you finish your long walk. And boy, was it long, because Benedict was just, seemed to be monosyllabic, and our president looked like he was trying to kickstart a conversation but failing. And you can only imagine. They later went up to a tower where they looked out at Vatican City, and there was the Pope, the President, and a papal aide. And our President asked, "Well, how many acres do you have?" And the Pope let his aide answer, about 109 acres. And it was noted that this was smaller than Texas, but more important. And then our president asked, "Do you ever get people, these walls that go around there?" He said, "Do you have people patrolling these walls?" And I said, "Well, sort of." "Do you ever have people trying to break in?" And they said, "Well, we don't have too much of that." And I'm not sure where our president was going with this, but it was about the time I think we were building a wall between Texas and Mexico. Maybe there was a parallel in his mind. I'm going to read you one last thing from the book, and then we'll talk about Pope Benedict, or Pope Francis. We have time, right? Yes. Covering Pope Benedict was very difficult for reporters. It wasn't so hard for us because we were Catholic News Service. Benedict was all about religion. He was about going back to the roots of the faith. He would give speech after speech about the church fathers, about the saints. Reporters in the secular press who had been used to John Paul II, kind of always feeding them a line or two about some current event, would get nothing from Benedict. And more than one of them would come to me on foreign trips or else at other venues, and they'd have the Pope's speech in their hand. They'd say, "John, what am I going to do with this? It's all religion." And I commiserated a little. You look hard enough, you'll find something. I wrote about the media trying to cover Benedict. This was on a particular trip to Germany, and I described a dinner that a bunch of us foreign correspondents had, including people from the New York Times, ABC, AP, Reuters. The consensus view at the table was that the Pope's media problem was that he hadn't defined himself, a failure that had handicapped reporters tremendously. To sell the Pope as a story, he had to have a persona, good or bad, but a figure with global impact. From the day of his election, the media had been searching for a Benedict persona, but nothing had stuck. The Pope had immediately shed this Hans or Cardinal image that had attached to him as the Vatican's doctrinal watchdog. Benedict had made it clear that he had a different agenda as Pope, telling one aide, "It was easy to teach the doctrine. Helping 1 billion people live it is quite another thing." Reporters quickly latched onto the image of Benedict the Gentle, making much of his supposed love of cats, birds, and other animals. We were assured by Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone that, as a cardinal, Benedict not only had fed the stray cats around the Vatican, but had also spoken to them, probably in Bavarian dialect. There were even rumors of a big tabby hiding out in the papal apartment. But our sources told us the Pope had no cat. Vatican rules prohibited pets in the papal quarters, and Benedict was no rule breaker. His longtime advisor, Ingrid Stampa, finally divulged that he'd never kept cats, except for 2 porcelain ones on a bookshelf. Another rumor held that Benedict loved teddy bears. According to Georg Ratzinger, his brother, had a great sensitivity to living creatures. So he was always receiving toy animals for Christmas. This is when the 2 were growing up. His teddy bear was supposedly the Pope's favorite. While taking in the footsteps of Benedict tour in Bavaria, the Catholic News Service reporter chatted with Franz Xavier Zeisser, who had lived next door to the Ratzingers as a young boy. Zeisser, who is 9 years younger than Joseph Ratzinger, said that as a teenager, the future Pope had a giant teddy bear back then, and he often used it to scare me. Zeisser decided one day he'd had enough, and he left a large hammer outside the Ratzinger house. When Joseph came at me with his teddy bear again, I raced outside and grabbed the hammer. There we stood, grimly facing each other, me gripping the hammer, and him his teddy bear. Eventually, we both put down our weapons, and that was the end of that, said Zeisser. I love this story because it made the Pope more human. At the same time, it was becoming clear that Benedict, as St. Francis of Assisi, was not going to stick either. During that trip, that was the famous trip to Bavaria, where he went to the University of Regensburg, and suddenly the news meter shot up as the Pope gave a speech, which, fascinating speech, but it angered a great part of the Muslim world. And for about a month, the persona that the media put on Benedict was that of the anti-Muslim crusader. And he had a trip coming up to Turkey where, you know, the Pope was going to tell Muslims like it is, especially on the issue of religious justification for violence. And here was a Pope finally who was not afraid to talk tough love to Muslims. He made the cover of Time magazine with a headline something like "The Pope Takes on Islam." Well, he went to Turkey. He said kind words about Islam, and then he prayed in a mosque. And I remember the scene quite well because we were watching it, and you know, visiting a mosque is one thing, but if you turn and pray toward Mecca with an imam by your side, for a lot of conservatives, that was like, you just don't do that. But he did. And of course, for the Pope, you're praying, we pray to the same God. Muslims and Christians pray to the same God. It was logical. Well, this image of the Pope as crusader was immediately retired, along with all the others. They never did figure out Pope Benedict. But I did. And now I'm going to tell you how I figured out Pope Benedict. I retired in 2012. I lost my privileged perch inside the Vatican. We moved back to Minnesota. I had this book coming out. I was finishing my book, and it was going to come out in February of 2013. So I had a good long time to sit and think. I bought a canoe, and when the fish weren't biting, I would sit and think about Pope Benedict. I was concerned somewhat that he might resign. I always knew that he had considered the possibility, theoretically, and I had purely selfish interests at heart. I thought that if he resigned too soon, my publisher would want me to rewrite parts of his book before it was out. On the other hand, if he resigned just as my book was coming out, well, that would be the perfect storm. So, I'm sitting there in my canoe, and I saw these telltale signs. I saw that he had finished his 3 books on Jesus of Nazareth. He had finished a cyclical talks and meetings with bishops from around the world. He didn't have too many big projects on his calendar. He had launched his new evangelization project. And I would actually email my friends in Rome, my journalist friends, saying, do you think the Pope might be thinking about resigning? They would totally ignore me. Late in the year, I emailed them saying, do you think he might resign in February? Now, this makes me sound very prophetic. I was actually thinking that he might choose February because February 22nd is the Feast of the Chair of Peter. That is a feast in the Catholic Church that's tied to the authority of the papacy. And I thought that if he did something so radically new that he might try to tie it to tradition in that way. My journalistic friends ignored me, and they thought I was crazy. In retrospect, I think it really was easier to see this from a distance. When you're there, covering the Pope day in, day out, there's really no good reason to convince you that, he was here today doing his thing, why wouldn't he show up tomorrow and do his thing? But I wisely booked a flight to Rome. I bought a plane ticket I arrived on February 10th of this year. And on February 11th, I walked into the Vatican press office and saw all my fellow journalists whom I hadn't seen in almost a year. The Pope had just announced his resignation. And they all looked up and looked at me and said, first, what are you doing here? And then they said, you knew. I didn't know. No one had tipped me off. But I'm sure glad I was there because I kind of became an instant pundit. When you've written a book, you're an expert, right? And I was an instant expert. And so suddenly I was on the other side of the journalistic notepad here. What happened when the Cardinals came to Rome? Well, I think many of the missteps and miscommunications and leaks and scandals that I chronicle in my book were on the Cardinals' minds. They saw the Roman Curia of the Vatican bureaucracy as pretty dysfunctional and in need of deep reform. And I think that attitude made things ripe for change. In a conclave, what happens is you march into the Sistine Chapel and vote, but for about a week before that, the cardinals meet and talk behind closed doors. But it's not quite as secret as a conclave. Cardinal Bergoglio of Buenos Aires stood up and told the cardinals things they wanted to hear. First, he said, our way of evangelizing. He said, it's got to be reflect the desire for the church to come out of itself, to come out of its own structures, to come out of its own theology. It's got to reach out to people. He said, otherwise it becomes self-referential, and that makes an institution sick. He spoke of theological narcissism. He said, when the church is self-referential, it comes to believe that it has its own life, that it takes its own path on a path toward spiritual, what he called spiritual worldliness. He said the next pope must be a man who, from the contemplation and adoration of Christ, helps the church go out to the outskirts of humanity. Well, all this sounded pretty good to the cardinals, and he made it also clear that the Roman Curia needed a shaking up, not just a retouch. It marked a changing course, I think. The church had just experienced 8 years of identity building under Pope Benedict, and really under John Paul II as well. Rewriting the Catechism of the Catholic Church was an exercise in Catholic identity building, and that was John Paul II's really longest lasting project. The church was largely under Benedict concerned with its own history, its own beliefs, its own liturgy, its own teachings. Now this pendulum I saw swinging toward a church that expresses itself more simply, that lives closer to the people, and that embodies the gospel in simpler ways. Now, this was going on behind closed doors. The journalistic coverage of this was practically nil. Reporters had a kind of baker's dozen of possible candidates, and Bergoglio was not even on their list. This is Cardinal Bergoglio, our Pope Francis. It is hard to cover a conclave. Okay? It's hard to cover meetings where none of the participants are supposed to talk. At least, they're not supposed to discuss content, which means they can talk about other things, whatever that is, those other things are. So, reporters generally would talk to themselves. And let me paint the scene. The Vatican press office, they had to expand it to have a satellite press office. There were 5,000 journalists mainly talking to each other. And I was one of them. And after a while, I said, I can't do this anymore. Number one, I'm getting overexposed. And I'm getting tired of hearing and saying the same thing. So I took 3 days off. I said, I'm not going into the press office for 3 days. And instead, I'm going and talking to as many cardinals as will speak to me. And after 3 days, I looked through my notebook, and I did find 4 or 5 who would talk to me. And I read my notes, and I said, boy, I got nothing here. They were so tight-lipped about everything. Just that, I mean, these guys. And I had even spoken to the ones who were over the age of 80, who are in these meetings but would not be voting in the conclave. I figured they would be more likely to spill their guts. Well, they weren't. But then I did notice one thing. 3 of these cardinals, without prompting, had mentioned the name of Bergoglio. Not saying he's going to be elected pope, but saying, well, he's a very good man, and he has a lot of respect. And I said, that's just too odd. And so it was the day before the conclave, and I had a blog and a website at this point, and I had avoided picking candidates wisely, and I decided, okay, it's Bergoglio for me, and I blogged about why Bergoglio was the guy to keep your eye on. And boy, am I glad I did that. The day I did that, by the way, there's a Vatican official I know quite well who was up in Dublin at the time. He was out of Rome. He was trying to keep tabs on what was going on in Rome, and he called me up and said, what are you hearing? What are you hearing? And I said, strangely, I'm hearing Bergoglio. He said, yeah, sounds unlikely. Okay, good. Well, I later found out he had gone to some of his friends who immediately went to Paddy Power and bet on Bergoglio. It was, I believe, 45 to 1 odds at the time. They did quite well. And they later came to Rome and bought me a very nice meal, I will say that. So, in fact, Bergoglio was elected. And, the Cardinals did this tremendously revolutionary thing. They elected a man with this kind of vision for the church. And we've seen what he's done. And I'll just hit the highlights because I want to leave room for your questions. But he's done so much in so short a time that it's built up a lot more expectations. He has, first of all, relocated the papacy outside the Roman Curia. And he's done this very astutely. First of all, by moving his living quarters outside the papal apartments, which happen to have been surrounded by Roman Curia offices. The Pope used to be virtually a prisoner of the Vatican bureaucracy. There were too many filters. People couldn't come and go, people couldn't see him, and the Pope couldn't come and go very easily. He has moved to the Vatican guest residence, which is a more informal place. And guests come and stay there. He can eat with different people if he wants. He rides the elevator with people. And he's also communicating more freely. He's not running his texts through the usual filters inside the Roman Curia. He gives these homilies every morning at Mass, which are rather revolutionary in their simplicity and what they're saying, and they're off the cuff. So nobody's editing his words the way they used to edit Pope Benedict. And believe me, they would. Pope Benedict would talk to journalists on his plane, and he'd say something, and we'd read the official transcript later, and we'd say, he didn't say that. And sure enough, somebody back in the Vatican had changed his words. They felt that they could do this because they were writing for the official record. And we would try to convince people at the Vatican, you can't do that. Pope has just spoken to the world through journalists, and you can't then go around and change what he said. But they never quite got that. So, Pope Francis is simply not going through them anymore. He is serious about reform. He has named a group of 8 cardinals to advise him. Now, what's important about this group is that only one of them works at the Vatican. You know, John Paul II tried to reform the Roman Curia too. His mistake was in appointing a huge commission, most of whom were Vatican officials. Well, you don't ask the foxes to guard the animals, right? I mean, if you want to make change, you name a small group, and then you have them move forward, and then you act on it. And so far, he's doing that. He's also indicated he's going to change the Synod of Bishops. I think he's going to govern in a more collegial way. He's going to share authority with bishops. I think he's going to clean up Vatican finances in a real way. Now, I give Pope Benedict credit for trying. He named the first institution that was supposed to oversee all these Vatican operations, but it was too complicated, much of it was too hidden, and there was too much resistance. Francis has actually named outside auditors who are auditing as we sit here. There are auditors in New York that are working to audit for the very first time an institution called APSA, which is the Vatican's investment and property management institution. And they've had big problems ever since one of their accountants was arrested for trying to smuggle millions of dollars into Italy a few months ago. The Pope has given interviews, uncensored interviews. He's said some things that have caught people's attention. You've probably heard some of these things. He said, "I see the church as a field hospital after battle." By that he means the church's main mission today is healing the wounds of people. He says the church has sometimes locked itself up in small things, in small-minded rules. The most important thing is the first proclamation, Jesus Christ has saved you. And the ministers of the church must be ministers of mercy above all. He said his primary role as Pope is discernment. He said this will be done with consultation. He has actually recalled his own mistakes as a young Jesuit provincial. He said, I was too authoritarian. Authoritarianism doesn't work. He says he doesn't want token consultation, but real consultation. Well, if he follows through on that, I think he's going to bring lay people to the Vatican. And this has been resisted for so long. The idea that, decision-making is tied to holy orders, so we can't have lay people in here messing things around. Not to speak about women. But I think this is going to happen under this Pope. I think he realizes that there are too many careerists at the Vatican, and the best way to clear them out is bring some lay experts in here. Let everybody know, perhaps, that you're not serving here for life, but for a short time you're making a sacrifice for the church. Well, I could go on, but I won't. I want to leave time for your questions. The best of Pope Francis is already quite long, and I do want to make one point. I think those who see Pope Francis as a classic kind of liberal should probably also be aware that I think he is a traditionalist as well. He is a traditionalist in the sense of he believes very strongly in the power of prayer. Look at his Twitter site sometime, his Twitter feed. Most of it is about prayer. He's got some very good lines there, by the way. It's at Pontifex. And it's a good way to follow him, if you just want to read a little bit every day. He's traditional in his belief in the presence of the devil in the world. He sees the devil as a real presence. In his devotion to Mary, one of his first thing he did as Pope was to go to a church in Rome dedicated to Mary. It's very real. And he's traditional when it comes to, I believe, the radical demands of the gospel. And this is something people are going to discover, I believe, when he starts speaking about social justice issues and economic issues. I think what he's going to say is going to be challenging, not just for, corporations or international agencies, but for individual Christians, especially those of us who live in the well-off part of the world. I think he's going to challenge everybody by the time this is over. So thank you. I'll take your questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you spent such a nice long time there, and I don't know what your constraints were about wandering around the actual facilities, but was there ever a time where you just kind of got struck with some of the magnificence and the amazing things that are physical objects that are there and that sort of thing, where you just went, whoa?
Yes, there were times when I went, whoa. Usually in these ceremonial halls, like there's a hall called the Sala Regia, just outside the Sistine Chapel is one place where that happens. Jaw-droppingly beautiful. And some of the chambers in the papal apartments are like that too. And yeah, some parts of St. Peter's Basilica are that way. However, there's the other side of that. I've also seen offices where the paint is peeling off the walls inside the Vatican, where people have complained about the conditions they're working in. I've seen waiting rooms up in the Secretariat of State. Some of you may have been up there. Where, under Paul VI, they made a decision to cover the walls in this kind of beige carpeting. Yeah, it's pretty bad. In fact, one of Massimo Sansolini's biggest complaints was the beige carpeting that they put on the walls. But, it's not all elegance. A lot of it is pretty mundane in a way. And part of that is because, although people don't believe me when I tell them this, the Vatican, in some ways, is not rich. It is rich in art, which they're not going to convert to cash. It is rich in property, but again, unless you start selling it off, you're not seeing much income. A lot of this property is rented out to religious orders that can't pay a lot of money. So it is cash poor. It has an annual budget of about $330 million. Now, do you know how little that is if you have a payroll of 4,000 people? And, it isn't much, I think. It's less than most major universities in this country. So, and that's why they're always got their begging cup up, right? Every year you're asked to contribute to Peter's Pence and in other ways. So yeah, I have seen, I think one of the public relations problems with the Vatican is that they tend to frame everything in opulence. And so, like Pope Benedict would say things about the world's economic system that were, really hard-hitting, as hard-hitting as anything Francis has said. And yet, he would say it from a gilded throne, and he'd be wearing this ermine-lined cape. And it would kind of, just kind of deflate the message. So I think Francis understands this. And I think that's one reason why he's moved into more modest quarters.
That's the follow-up question, I think. Is
Okay.
If you work in the Vatican, do you have to pay taxes to the Vatican, income taxes?
If you're an employee of the Vatican, you don't pay Italian income tax.
Okay.
So that's a benefit, definitely, because most employees of the Vatican live in Italy. And there are other benefits too. You get pretty good health care, real good health care, single payer model. The salaries are not great at the Vatican. Okay? If you make $2,000 a month, that's pretty good. So the cost of living is quite high in Rome. So it's not that the salaries are great. So nobody who works for the Vatican is getting rich by working for that. Yes, who else? Yes.
About the Vatican investments, you told us they're going to search it out and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
It must have a little potential fraud, or are they
Well,
good investments like, I'll say $50 million in this one investment question?
I think the investments themselves are pretty up and up. They've been looked at, certainly by cardinal commissions and other people. And the Vatican has had minor scandals in investments. I think think it was once discovered they had invested in a Swiss company that made birth control pills or something. But it was inadvertent, so, you know. I think the actual investment program is pretty well looked at. What they're auditing right now is what happens with all the other money that's floating around. What happens with the investment income? What happens to that? And there's been all kinds of weird things that have happened. So that's really what they're looking at more than the investment picture. As far as I know, the Vatican invests quite safely. They made some mistakes in currency over the years. They seem to have no knack for business, no knack for making money. They invested in dollars right before dollars went to the nosedive, and they invested in euros at the wrong time. There was a few years ago, the Vatican put out, well, they had noticed that a Spanish company had put out a CD of Pope John Paul II reciting the Rosary. It became a bestseller. Sold millions and millions of copies. So they decided, well, we can make our own. So they did. And they got it out just in time so that everyone who had wanted a copy had already bought one. They sold nothing. They have a knack for not being good capitalists, I would say. Yes?
We're seeing a movie of this. I kept drawing parallels in my mind. Volcano, who was recently here from the Washington Post, wrote The Butler, and the inside story of the White House. And the
Right.
inside story.
Yeah, actually, my agent has been in touch with people in Hollywood, but whether anything will come of it, who knows. Yeah, it's not a single story, it's more episodic, but there are some things that have drawn people's attention. And I'm open to that.
Well, especially the Steve Sansolini character that you mentioned.
The who?
The Sansolini character. The
Oh, I know.
Yes.
He's tremendous. He could play himself.
If they can do Hunter S. Thompson, Fear and Loathing, we can do
Hey,
Fear and
right,
Loathing.
exactly. Yes?
It seems like you have a pretty good handle on the ins and outs, and is there anything that you've come across in your time at Vatican that has taken you aback or surprised you, things that you didn't see coming,
Well, that's a good question, one I haven't really thought about. So is there anything that's taken me aback at the Vatican or surprised me? I was actually quite taken aback once, in a very personal way. I think it was 2002, when Pope John Paul II, you know, he does the annual, the Easter liturgies, and one of them is the Way of the Cross at the Colosseum. And every year he would ask, like an eminent theologian or somebody, to write the meditations for each station of the cross. Well, this particular year he asked journalists to write the stations of the cross, one journalist for each station. And they asked me to write the meditation for the very first station, which in this version was the Agony in the Garden. And I was, you know, yes, taken aback, shocked, and of course I said, oh, I would be honored, of course I'll do that, and then I immediately regretted it, you know, it's like, I'm going to do this, what do I have to say to the Pope about the Agony in the Garden? You know, what can I, not only that, but there's about a million things I could say that might draw his verbal objections, and I pictured the Pope struggling to his feet to say, it is not so, or something like that. I was pretty daunted by this task, but I made it through okay. And the Pope was so gracious about everything we journalists came up with. He thanked us, and it was wonderful. So, and that was typical of John Paul II, who actually would, from time to time, go outside the usual borders of the church to get some input. And so he wasn't afraid of what journalists would write. Yes?
I wonder if you could talk for a moment, if you can, about your experience in the way other journalists would respond to their experiences, either short-term or long-term in Rome. I'm thinking back to the time when John Paul II was in his last days after he died, and I remember seeing on television various journalists, American television newscasters, being visibly moved by it. I wonder if they ever said anything in private to you that really, my stiff, Western secular facade was just to show
Yeah.
I really am a secret believer.
No, they didn't. They didn't have to. But that phenomenon was very real. When John Paul II died, and we all saw him, his casket being carried into St. Peter's and the doors closed. I mean, that was just very moving. And not that we sort of agreed with everything the Pope said or did, or even thought that he necessarily was a saint or was the greatest Pope ever. But we had spent so much time with him and gotten to know him pretty well. And, the Vaticanisti, who are journalists specializing in Vatican affairs, are a pretty small tribe of people. They tend to stick around for a long, long time. Once you're kind of pegged for that, you stay there. And there are reasons for this. But so as a result, we had all kind of grown up with this Pope. And so it was a very personal moment in that way. I think that accounts for that reaction. It wasn't necessarily that they had all converted at the same moment, no. Yes?
There's focus in the book on Pius XII's cause, right?
Yes.
Now he's either sidelined or on the back burner. We've got the dual canonization.
Yeah.
I mean, could you see that coming, or what do you think of that?
I was surprised. I foresaw that John Paul II would be canonized because there's just so much momentum behind this. It's not going to stop. And part of getting to the finish line in this sainthood business is momentum. Although you would have expected Mother Teresa to have the same kind of momentum, and she's still waiting to be canonized. So, John the 23rd was a complete surprise. And it's very significant, I think, that Pope Francis has decided, I'm going to canonize these two at the same time, for two reasons. Number one, he simply waived the requirement for a second miracle. And, the Church has always said, there have been exceptions in the past, but very, very few. The Church has said a miracle is that sign of approval, kind of divine approval that we look for, and that kind of certifies this person is really in heaven. And so, for him to waive it and simply say, we know he's a saint, was unusual procedure. And I've since spoken with Vatican officials and asked them, does this mean now that we're not going to require miracles? No. We require all miracles. This is the exception that proves the rule. Okay, fine. But also significant, of course, was that I think I think Pope Francis is very much inspired by John the 23rd. I think he's taken him as his model. And I think he didn't want to canonize John Paul II without paying homage to John the 23rd, because I think he sees himself as the Pope who's going to pick up where John the 23rd left off. Yes?
I think the miracle is that John the 23rd went for him to be the
Yes, exactly. You can look at it that way, although most Vatican officials wouldn't. Well, when it comes to miracles for sainthood causes, they prefer like miraculous cures, not kind of moral miracles, where there are a lot of times in life where you say, wow, this person really changed. It's like a miracle. I prayed for it. It could be, but that's not the kind of miracle that can kind of be ascertained in a way, in a more scientific way. That the Church can say there is no explanation for this that we can put forward, as opposed to those kind of hidden changes. There can be other explanations. Yes.
I so would like to carry on about that, but because this is not my question, this is my statement.
Okay.
It seems to me that part of what Pope Francis is doing is shifting our theological sensitivity away from the extraordinary to the ordinary. And so it would be very fitting for the miracle of the masses being moved to sufficient sign of a person's holiness rather than the extraordinary that even some of the extraordinary years gone by would probably explain now like science. But that's not my
Right.
question.
That's a good point. Why don't you write that to him in a letter? I might actually take your suggestion.
Yeah, I think I really think that's true. I think, and on the same line, I think his move from the extraordinary to the ordinary is a move from the encyclical to the interview.
Mm-hmm.
And the interview speaks to people. Millions of people have read about or read the interview. The one that was given to the Jesuit
Right.
groups. And that's touched people. Very few people read encyclicals.
Yeah.
But a lot of people argue them.
I totally agree with you there.
The other thing I really want to ask about, which isn't nearly as important, is I'm wondering what your experience of whatever the Vatican's parallel to our Secret Service is like, which was really, really stunning to me when I saw those magnificent photos of all the balloons at the Celebration for the Family, which I thought were some of the most beautiful pictures I've ever seen at the Vatican.
Right.
And yet I couldn't help but think of the balloons popping and the security people going crazy.
Yeah.
And I wonder how that, because his style would not be conducive to making Secret Service people happy.
Right, right. Yeah, I don't want to say this too loudly, but the security of the Vatican is very, very porous. Even though they have metal detectors around with silicon on, you know, anybody who wants to harm the Pope probably can. It's unfortunate but true. They try to do a good job, discreet, do a good job, and I've seen strange things happen. I mean, there was a guy when Benedict was riding in his open Jeep in St. Peter's Square. Some deranged man actually jumped in the Jeep, and the security people were so good that they had him off the Jeep and down on the ground before the Pope even. The Pope never noticed. You know. On the other hand, this woman from Switzerland wearing a red hoodie tried to jump in one Christmas Eve on his way processing into the midnight mass, and they sent her on her way. And the next Christmas Eve, she was there again and did manage to tackle him. He was fine. But, you know, it's like, you can't, you know, you either isolate the Pope from crowds or you don't. And they have several levels of security. They have the Swiss Guards who are actually armed, although they don't wield their weapons. But, you know, besides the halberds, they're trained in using guns. They're the Vatican gendarmes, Vatican's own police force, and they're a pretty crack team. Then there's the Italian police who actually do duty when the Pope is in St. Peter's Square, which is such a big area. And it's hard to protect the Pope. I mean, John Paul II was shot in St. Peter's Square during an audience. So it's, I don't know, sometimes I think the less said about it, the better, in a way. And the fact is, the Pope does not ride around usually in a bulletproof bubble. They're usually in an open Jeep or an open car of some kind, or just up on an altar up in the crowd. And I don't think they want to lose that. Yes, in the back.
Question of how the reporters do their job. One of the things that I saw about this interview that Pope Francis gave is the person that was interviewed hadn't taken notes, it wasn't recorded. And he went back to his desk and sort of recounted the whole thing. Is that fairly common?
Well, yes. There are actually a couple of interviews here. One was the interview with the Jesuit priest. It came out in American Magazine. That was transcribed and so on. The other was a conversation that the Pope is having in different stages with a rather famous Italian atheist who founded a secular Rome newspaper, who is famous for kind of writing columns in the newspaper, questioning the church and questioning popes. And so the Pope has decided, well, let's have a dialogue and kind of put in practice what he's preaching, which is that we need to talk with people who don't share our beliefs. And so this guy, Eugenio Scalford, went back after having this conversation, and he took no notes and didn't record anything, and reconstructed the conversation, and it came out as an interview. And the Vatican signed off on it. And yes, this is common in Italy. It's not common by Anglo-Saxon standards. Journalists would go, oh my God, what? No notes? No tape recorder? What are you, crazy? But it wasn't really an interview. It was a conversation that this guy then capsulized. And I will say this, that Italians are greatly skilled at this. You know, they can listen to an hour-long thing and then accurately pretty well reproduce it. Now, to my amazement, I don't know how they do it. They seem to have an innate skill with this. So I think it probably was pretty accurate in the end. Yes?
So similarly, you spoke about that there were people in that who talked too much.
Right.
Thank God.
Yeah.
So how did you deal with that? You have a concern that you might write too much and there might be consequences, or is there a protocol?
There might have been a few pangs of conscience, but normally no, I wrote whatever I did. Unless it was told to me totally off the record, you can't print this. And normally I wouldn't want to have that conversation, but there were times when, okay, tell me what's really going on, and then I'll use it sometime in the future to get other information. But no, there were, most of the time, and there were times when I would call people up on the phone, and I could just hear them stumbling into telling me more than they should. And yeah, I would feel a little bit bad about it, but I felt really good about having the story. So I would write it out. And there was one time like that when I was just calling around, because I had noticed that for years in this report I had read about the Vatican's, every Vatican agency does a little report that usually doesn't see the light of day, but I had gotten a hold of a report of what one congregation was working on, and it was a document that was aimed at keeping gay men out of the seminary. I thought, I wonder if there's been any follow-up on that. So I just called around to people I sort of knew, one of whom I didn't know at all. And they started telling me, oh yeah, the document's almost done. Well, oh, what's it going to say? Well, it's going to say that if you're gay, you can't be a priest. Oh, really? Well, why not? And it was a huge story. It was the first time this had come out. They eventually did publish the document years later. But when I wrote my story, the next week I had Vatican officials denying it. And so, you know, but, so they probably got in trouble for saying it. Yes?
I'm just curious, how many of the people who work in Vatican City live?
How many people who work in Vatican City live there? Not many. There are about 350 residents, official residents of Vatican City. The only people who really reside inside Vatican City, which, as President Bush found out, was 109 acres, not very big, smaller than a golf course, the only people who really live there are the higher Vatican officials who are given apartments there. So you probably got to be a bishop or an archbishop to be living in there. And the rest of them just come in every day. Yes?
You said you covered the Vatican for 30 years.
Yes.
And did you live in that area, or did you live in the United States?
No, I lived in Rome.
Okay. And what would a typical day be like for you?
Well, I get up and over breakfast read emails, and then go into the office at about 8:39. And the Vatican workday starts about 9, and it goes to 1:30, and then it ends. Although theoretically they come back 2 afternoons a week, but they don't really. So you got to kind of pick your spots. Like the middle part of the day is by far the busiest part of the day. And that's when the Vatican puts out its official daily bulletin of news. And then that comes out at noon. You have about 1 hour to find out any more information, which you often need to make sense of what's in the bulletin. And so that's the hectic time. And then in the afternoons, we would spend either with interviews or calling around and finding out what's going on. The workday changed a lot for me over those 30 years. When I first started reporting on the Vatican, things were a lot slower. Not much was happening at the Vatican. They wouldn't sponsor very many press conferences. When I wanted to research a story, I would often go over to the Gregorian University Library and read theological journals or other things to get some ideas. I mean, nowadays, you never leave your computer. It's like, okay, Google this, Google that, and then you go out and make your person-to-person contacts. And it's all fast. And nowadays, Vatican-sponsored conferences, there are at least 1 or 2 a week, so it's a lot busier. There's a ton more information at a journalist's disposal. I'm not sure journalists do a better job because a lot of journalism today is rewriting what other journalists have written. And it used to be that every journalist had their own angle on the story. And if I wrote something for Catholic News Service, they would have to come to me to get it. Well, now they go online and they steal it. So, the information is just out there. Yes?
I'm kind of amazed at the direction the church went from Pope Benedict to Pope Francis. And what was the reasoning why Pope Benedict was selected and why Pope Francis? And what was the, how was that direction? I mean, I just wonder something different.
It does seem odd that the College of Cardinals who elected a conservative like Benedict would then turn to a man like Francis. I think there are several reasons for this. When Benedict was elected, the Cardinals were looking above all for continuity, and they all knew Benedict from over the years. He'd been there as long as John Paul II, almost. They had had personal contact with him. They trusted him. He was a known quantity. And the hardest part, I think, about Cardinals coming together for a conclave is knowing who they're voting for. They don't know each other very well. That's the little secret of conclaves. Their paths may cross in Rome a few times over the years, but they're not going around visiting and touring each other's dioceses or archdioceses. They're not seeing these people as pastors. They're seeing them as a guy who gives a speech at a Vatican conference or something. So it's very hard to judge. And so they voted for, Ratzinger because he was smart, he was trustworthy, and they knew him well. This time around, they didn't have somebody like that from the Vatican, so they had to look further afield. And again, I think they really liked what Bergoglio said in these meetings that led to the conclave. And I think they knew that the Roman Curia had to be reshaped. I think they felt Benedict, one of the reasons he resigned was that the Vatican's own bureaucracy had not served him well, and they wanted to correct it. And so I am not convinced that they quite knew what Pope Francis was all about when they elected him, because he has done far more than what anyone thought he would do, and he's been more kind of a radical gospel figure than people would have guessed. And I know that's true because the people I talked to immediately after he was elected were predicting almost some conservative moves. We'll get some conservative. Well, nobody knew him very well. I didn't know him very well either. I had never spoken to him. I never interviewed him. He rarely came to Rome. He didn't want to spend the money, he said. So he was an outsider. He was elected in part because he was an outsider. Now they're finding out really how big an outsider he was.
I have to say, maybe the Holy Spirit has something.
Yes, I wanted to add that. Maybe the Holy Spirit had something to do with it. You can't discount that in seeing these kind of changes in the church. We should probably wrap up. One more question?
I'm just curious what you missed the most from your years there and what you enjoyed the most out of the community. And do you have the option of always popping out of that community and planning to go over there or something?
I do have that option. Fortunately, I'm working on another book now, but I've been to Rome several times in the last. I was there in September. I'm going next week for 2 weeks. And so, I dip my feet in and out. I get my plates of pasta and my vino rosso, and what's really nice I don't miss the day in, day out going to the job. I really don't. I am working pretty hard on what I'm doing right now, but it's riding on my own time. I do kind of miss, and what I like about going back is when I walk into the press office now, I still have accreditation, and they're always going to consider me accredited because I was there so long. It's like, I feel at home there. It's a nice place that way. And that's one of the nice things about working there. Yeah. Thank you.